Hello, this is my zine presentation on Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. The first few pages, of course, are just biography, probably the least visually interesting, mainly because there was just so much information I had to condense down. I wanted the text itself to be most prominent and legible. Um, and even then, there's a lot I could have included that just got cut out for the sake of balance. In any case, he was born to a reasonably comfortable family, essentially middle class, though there were also some wealthier relatives that he would have been in contact with in Ireland. He was born in Scotland, in Edinburgh, um, and he had a Jesuit schooling as a child, later on went to medical school in Edinburgh, received his diploma, began practicing medicine, and at the same time started writing short stories. He had a lifelong interest in history that was cultivated by his mother. His mother was a very strong influence on him throughout his life. Um, so he liked writing historical fiction, but at some point, he tried his hand at some mystery detective stories. I think perhaps under the influence maybe of Edgar Allan Poe, whom he admired. Um, and this became A Study in Scarlet, the first Sherlock Holmes mystery adventure. Um, and it would only be a few years that passed before this character of his, Sherlock Holmes, and Dr. John Watson, made him a pretty great success in um, in the British market and actually the English speaking market. He was very popular in America as well. Dr. John Watson, I think you can see a lot of the author reflected in, as he also practices medicine and is an ardent patriot. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was incredibly patriotic. In fact, he was knighted not for the cultural influence of his Holmes stories, um, but for political writings and essentially wartime propaganda that he would write during the Boer War and the First World War. Um, During the Boer War, which was a conflict, or actually a series of conflicts of the British Empire in South Africa, he and a friend actually took it upon themselves to open up a hospital for soldiers, the Langman Hospital. And later on in the zine, there is a photograph of the surgeon staff. So the temptation definitely is to talk a lot about Sherlock Holmes, because that is the creation of his for which he's still known, and is also just a character that's taken on such a life of his own that it's difficult to separate him into just one part of this author's life. But I do want to stress that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's life was really eventful. Um, he, he had these wartime activities. He was politically involved. He advocated for the lives of several criminals. Even at one point, became sort of an amateur detective himself, in an instance of life imitating art, as it were, and proved, or at least contributed significantly to proving the innocence of George Adalji, who was a falsely accused young man, who was acquitted in 1907, I believe, um, after Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had assisted in his case. So he was a really interesting guy. Um, he was married twice. He had a number of children by his first wife. Um, One of his sons, Kingsley, died during the First World War, pretty young. And after this, Doyle turned to spiritualism, which was a religious movement of the 19th century that was largely about communicating with ghosts or the spirits of the dead through psychic mediums, um, things that we'd recognize a lot today, and sort of paranormal related media was also going on, or kind of getting its beginnings around this time. Um, so this is an interesting sort of contradiction in his character, I think. He, throughout his life, had been very rationally disposed and skeptical, but he also had this interest in the paranormal. It wasn't just psychics and ghosts, he also believed in fairies and spirit photography. I didn't include a picture or much mention of this in the zine, but there was this hoax around the Cottingley fairies. These two sisters had taken photographs of themselves with these paper cutout fairies, and of course, photos at the time, you could get away with a little bit more and make something look plausibly realistic. Anyway, Doyle was thoroughly persuaded in the veracity of these photographs, which is a little funny. And it's interesting that none of this sort of made its way into his Holmes character, though some of it did, I think, into the stories of one of his other characters, Professor Challenger. In any case, he was also friends with a couple other important figures of the period, including Rudyard Kipling and Harry Houdini, which is pretty funny. Though, because Houdini was actually a pretty fierce critic of spiritualism and superstition in general, another interestingly mixed sort of character. He was a stage magician, so he liked pulling his own sort of tricks, creating his own illusions, but he was very impatient with people trying to make such illusions actually seem real and take advantage of people's grief to, promote this spiritualism belief. So he engaged in a lot of what we would now call debunking, and this caused a rift between himself and Doyle. So the legacy of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle really is Sherlock Holmes. It's difficult to say that it is really anything else, even though he did have a lot else going on during his life. And Sherlock Holmes was not even necessarily his favorite creation. He famously tried to kill off Holmes at one point, so that he could stop writing the character, but even at the time, Holmes was what he was known for and what paid the best. So his mother also nudged him quite a bit to keep writing those Sherlock Holmes stories, and eventually he caved and continued writing them. But yeah, of course, Sherlock Holmes, you don't even have to be acquainted with the original stories. You don't even really have to have seen any of the many, many adaptations or spin offs or parodies or pastiches to get the reference to Sherlock Holmes, right? My personal favorite Holmes is Jeremy Brett, who played him for Granada Television in the 80s. I have a set on VHS of this series. It's great. He's great. And I think his performance inspired a lot of Robert Downey Jr.'s. But anyway, that's aside from the point. I think it is really remarkable that any author could have a creation with the staying power and the cultural relevance of a Sherlock Holmes. I think to have a character whose name has become an idiom, no shit Sherlock, is kind of a form of immortality, right? So that is the long and short of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's life and his works. Strange, interesting guy. And again, there's a lot that I just wasn't able to cover in much depth. But he did write his own biography. He wrote an autobiography called Memories and Adventures, which for this project I was able to read a few chapters of at least, and it is pretty interesting. You can find it online. Uh, as far as my creative process creating this zine, um, I'll preface this by saying that I have never liked computers, even though I have grown up in the age of them. I have never really liked working with them, so a lot of my creative process, so to speak, was really just me frantically trying to figure out what all of these cockamamie icons were supposed to do, and being constantly a little trepidatious of doing something that would completely mess up the formatting. Um, I'm so glad that I chose to do it this way rather than analog, because I got to learn a bit of a new skill, and maybe if I have to do something like this again, it will come out a little bit better and be less stressful. But right, so the creativity um, was really me stumbling through things and just trying to use my best aesthetic judgment to make something presentable. Um, so I'm at least moderately pleased with the result, and I hope you are as well. Thank you.